Mr. Ruth, and I don't know, is this working? Where's our? I don't believe this is working. Is it? Where's our man? He's going to start it. I hope you can hear me, but I thought I was going to have a microphone here. Oh, you got the tape. Oh, all right. To divert a little bit, I want to tell you that Mrs. Gentry, who served your dinner tonight, had served all day in the cafeteria, and her assistants too, and I personally appreciate that she's willing to do things like that when it's a lot of extra working time for her. I was very ignorant, you might say, of just what the Westerners were, and I'm very flattered to have so many distinguished people here and so many from outside of the city. They're quite representative of around the state. The great trouble I had in thinking about this was how in the world I was going to cut it down short enough that you wouldn't be bored to death. You start a man who's had 90 years of experience, and if you ask him to go back, well, there's so much that it's bound to be more or less confusing. I can't organize it all chronologically, and I think perhaps it'll sound a good deal like personal biography, which I don't want it to do. However, I'm going to start with something that had nothing to do with Oklahoma, because I believe that it shows throws a little light on the pioneer days. As a boy, I went to Colorado. I was 6 years old, and my father went into business in Denver, and then he got the mining fever, which nearly everyone had, and we moved to several different parts of the state. And I crossed the divide in the stagecoach because there was no railroad. It stopped at the foot of the mountain. And when we moved from a town up near Gunnison to a town down the San Luis Valley, Saguache, it took us 3 days in a freighter's wagon. Of course, there was no railroad and no other means of travel. And it may interest you to know that when we got to Saguache, for instance, they had a campground which is very similar to our motels. That is, you parked your team and you fed your horses out of your wagon and slept in the wagon, but there was a camp house there with a big fireplace, and you went in and cooked whatever you wanted to, and there were lots of people doing it. But I won't go into that further, because that would bother you, except to say that the pioneers made do. Now, we couldn't carry furniture, for instance, over the mountains in freighter wagons. You had to have clothing and food and everything else. And so you made your own furniture, and you built your own houses. My father built a house up in Pitkin. That was the first place we went, a mining place. And then we left there 6 months and went to this town of Saguache, and he built 2 different houses while we were there. And then we went to Grand Junction, and we built 3 houses. The first one was the ready when we got there, 3-roomed house. And then my brother and I and my father built the second house out of adobes. We made the adobes. And much of the furniture was made. Now, other people had less boughten furniture than we had, but I've seen chairs out of barrels we just cut out there and put a seat and a cushion in there that were fairly common, and little cross-legged chairs that were made. And some people carried a rocker. Some ladies don't want a rocker, and they'd carry a rocker, but you made your other furniture. And beds were made. That was no trick at all to make take some lumber and make a bed, and the same way with the table. And that was necessary because there was no method of transportation that was adequate. And these freighters' wagons were the only means of transportation of goods. And the stagecoaches were the common transportation for. I sat on my mother's lap and got my head bumped a number of times and going over the roads made out of poles and swampy places, and then over rocks going around the mountain curves and so on. I just mentioned that just because a lot of people look back at the generation before mine, at my generation, and think how dumb they were and how little they had. But that's the generation that started all these improvements. I was 7 years old when Edison made the electric light, the first one, in October 1880. Of course, there were no typewriters, no fountain pens, and no carbon paper. The first job I had in a store, I always made copies with a letterpress. Probably some of you know what that was, but you had a very thin sheet of tissue paper. You'd put it over the written letter, dampen it, and put it under this press, and press it real hard for a few minutes. Then you had to read it through the back of the paper, of course. You had the impression of the letter, and that's the way we made copies of our correspondence. Now, to get down to Oklahoma, I might tell you how I happened to come here. I'd been in Cripple Creek at clerk of a court, and my brother and I had bought a paper in Colorado Springs. We both each borrowed the money, and my brother was running the paper, and I was up in Cripple Creek. And then when I left there, I went back to the paper. But we sold that paper, and my brother bought a paper in St. Joe, Missouri, and I didn't like the town, and he wanted me to come there, and I refused. And I was in western Colorado, and he pleaded with me to meet him in Colorado Springs, and I went there, and he persuaded me to go to St. Joe, and I was business manager of the paper for about 8 or 9 months. I got very tired because I was working till 1 o'clock at night, often at a new morning paper, and I had to do a lot of the building of the equipping machinery and everything. And came Christmas time, I didn't know anybody around there, and I thought I'd go someplace, and I had a hunch. Something told me to go to St. Louis. I didn't know a soul in St. Louis and didn't want to see anybody there, but I went down there. I loafed around the hotel for 2 or 3 days, and while there I read a little, what we'd call 2 sticks of type in the St. Louis Republic. It was an interview with Carter Harrison, mayor of Chicago, who had been down in Texas, and he came through Oklahoma. And he said that Oklahoma was going to be a future state, just a territory, that it could raise the crops of the south and raise the crops of the north. And he saw the fields were white with cotton as he went through. He said if he was a young man, he'd locate in Oklahoma. And it was an inspiration to me. And I went back to St. Joe and told my brother I was coming down here to look for a paper. Oh, he said, I can't spare you. I said, you've got to, because this means something for my life, and you can get somebody else to do this work. I came down here in December 1902, right after Christmas, and I first walked all around the town, all around the business section. There's supposed to be about 10,000 population, but it was just a country town. 4 blocks were paved. 2 on Broadway, 1 on Grand, and 1 on Main between Broadway and Robinson. To see the town, I walked as far north as was a house, which is the Dewey Cottage at 12th and Hudson. I walked as far west there was a house which is about western. I walked over, there was a house clear on the 1100 block on East 10th. I walked to Capitol Hill, and there were probably 20, 25 houses on the whole south side there. That's called Capitol Hill later. And but I walked around the business houses and looked at the windows to see what merchandise was offered. And I was greatly encouraged to see a music store, Frederickson Crow Music Company, that had pianos on sale, and one probably secondhand, but a Steinway piano. And I thought if people that were here were thinking about things like that and were buying things of that sort, why, it wasn't entirely the rough frontier town that it appeared to be. So I went to a banker and asked him about the two papers here, the Times Journal in the evening, the Oklahoman in the morning. And I asked him who owned them and so forth, and what kind of people they were. And I asked him which one I should try to buy. He says, don't make a damn bit of difference. Neither one of them is worth a damn. I tried to buy into the evening paper because I'd had a lot of night work on the morning paper, but they weren't interested at all in having a business manager or anybody put some little money in to help them. So I made a deal with Mr. Stafford, who owned the Oklahoman. He had the building is still there at 28 South Broadway. It was 25 by 60 feet, and everything was in there, including a job shop. And there were two linotypes and a flatbed press and 3,500 circulation. And it was the dirtiest place I was ever in. The cobwebs were hanging down 2 feet from the ceiling. Well, there's no use going into those things. But anyway, eventually he looked up my references, and I looked up to him, and I found he was honest, and that was the main thing. And I took over. Well, a lot of things happened. One of the first things happened, I might say this to show you how inflation has hit us. I got a room and board for $4 a week on 3rd Street here, just off Broadway. And it was fairly good board, too. So at 15 cents a meal for 21 meals, that'd be $3.15 and about 85 cents for your room per week. At the Saddle Rock restaurant, across from what's now the Huckins Hotel, you could get ham and eggs and coffee and toast for 15 cents. It was just as good then as it is today, too. That block across from the Huckins, wasn't the Huckins then, of course, was called Battle Row. And all of the buildings, upstairs and down, except the Saddle Rock restaurant and the City Hall on the corner of Grand and Broadway, were gambling houses and saloons. And in the Two Johns Saloon that was next to this restaurant, Bossy Mulhall, Mulhall was named for her father, of course, rode her horse into the saloon and had a whiskey straight without getting out of the saddle. They had a troop of soldiers come up here for a celebration in February, just a week or two after I got here. They had a parade and so on, and some drunk shot one of the soldiers and killed him. And so I was very anxious to get all details, and we didn't have one reporter and one editor, and I got all the details I could and saw that everything was turned in, and stayed there till 9 o'clock at night to see that everything was all in. And next morning I looked at the paper and I couldn't find, there wasn't a word on the front page, and I looked all the pages inside, I went back and forth, I couldn't find a word about that murder. And I went down pretty mad. I didn't know what had happened. I got down there and I found that the president of the Chamber of Commerce had come to Mr. Stafford. He was the editor and I was the manager. And it persuaded him that it hurt the town to publish the fact that we had a murder like that. Well, of course, the Kansas City and the Dallas papers came in here with a story, and I certainly burned them up about that. Well, as luck would have it, there was another murder right next to our building. In the alley right alongside of our building. About 11 o'clock in the morning. And I proceeded to get out an extra and put both murders in there. And we sold them that afternoon, all those morning papers. Now, of course, there were no automobiles in this was January 1903. No automobiles, no streetcars, although they were preparing, Mr. Classen preparing to put in a car line. At the corner where the Colcord building is, there were a group of cottonwood trees, and it was a low, swampy place. There's usually a little water standing there. When he built that, he had to put some caissons down and make pretty deep foundations. There was a lumber yard on the other end of the block where the Baltimore building is now. There was Classen had laid out the better part of Oklahoma City, which was from 13th Street to 16th Street, but there were no houses there. Mr. Overholtz was building a house, corner of 15th and Hudson, but there were no houses there. But all the streets laid out, dirt streets, of course, and all the blocks were planted to wheat, so he was harvesting wheat there from what is now the old Bonton part of Oklahoma City. Now downtown, of course, the Rock Island Railroad went right through, as you know, right through the Skirvin swimming pool is where the Rock Island Depot was. And the City Hall is now where the Frisco Depot was. Well, Armour and Company had a wholesale meat plant where the Skirvin Tower is, but it was facing Broadway and paralleling the Rock Island tracks. And there was a little store on the corner, but the lots all faced Broadway, you know, and not Park Avenue. There were two 5-story buildings in town. One was the Lee Hotel, which is where the Huckins is now, and the other was the Culbertson building down at the foot of Broadway and Grand. And there was a 4-story building, which is still here. The Empire building is next to the theater down there on Main Street, you know, the Criterion Theater. Well, we had pictures of those, and we'd run one of them nearly every Sunday, and I think we wore those out, run them month after month, the same ones to show people that there were really some 4- and 5-story buildings in Oklahoma City. I saw something that's hard to believe now, but I saw a horse and buggy mired on Main Street just west of Robinson, in front of what was then West Falls Drugstore. We get rain, and not only all the rain that fell there, but the Rock Island tract used to back up the water, and then there'd places where it'd break through and it'd run down and fill the streets with water, and so the mud was plenty deep. And in the dry weather, of course, in the next year, I boarded on 3rd Street, opposite the present post office, and walking down in the dust there, and there weren't any sidewalks there, most of them. Walking down there, the dust was often 2 or 3 inches deep, and I'm not going to have all these things in chronological order, as you can understand. They're just things, and unfortunately, things come to me that I didn't have notes of here, too. Now, people came in here from around, but took today, a man come in here from Paul's Valley. He had to stay overnight. To drive in here with a team, you know, it was a hard day's work to drive up here. but a few people came in horse and buggies, but more you saw was the regular wagon, the team of horses. Now, the Episcopal Church was the corner of 4th and Broadway. We bought it in 1906. It was a frame church there, and they moved up on 7th Street. We bought that. The Southern Methodist Church was on 3rd Street, and you had high stairs to go up there. That was all a bluff. It must have been 10, 12 feet above the level of 3rd Street. And people had to go upstairs to get to the little church there. At the corner of 2nd and Broadway, the northeast corner, was a similar bluff. And they had stairs up there to 3 or 4 cottages around that corner. Of course, that was all leveled down to build the Threadgill Hotel, which was our fine hotel there for many years. And you can see they didn't cut the hill down all the way back because the YMCA is on top of that hill. And on 4th Street, as you know, it's cut back there for the Methodist Church and for these other buildings this side. But at the alley side, it's very high, you know. And that came clear out to not only to 4th, but clear down to 3rd Street. It's a high bluff. The Christian church was at 3rd and Robinson, where the Braniff building is, now a mortgage building. And that was the largest tented church, I think, in the town at the time. The First Presbyterian Church was 6th and Broadway. And, of course, these were all fairly small. And the best homes in town were on 6th Street. And Mr. Richardson had his residence, which was perhaps the finest in town at that time, on the corner where the temple was built. You know, there's now an insurance building on 6th, on the west side of 6th. Well, Mr. Richardson was president of the First National Bank, and that was the corner of Main and Broadway on the southwest corner. And the building was up, so you had to go up 3 or 4 steps to get in there. Mr. Richardson told me an experience he had before I came here. That was a little interesting. A year or so before I came here, somebody started a run on that bank, and people commenced coming in from all directions, you know, demanding their money. Well, after a bit, they saw the merchants coming in with a big sack of money, and they passed in the window, and they'd come and take that, you know. And Bill Petty came in with a big sack of money and marked $100, you know, marked on the sacks. And the grocery stores and the other merchants, they kept coming in with that. And finally, this long line there, they were there a good many hours drawing their money out. Of course, they're probably a little slow in dealing it out. But finally, they said, well, what's the use of all these merchants putting their money in here? Why should we? So they dispersed about the end of the day. But they'd paid out a lot of money. They checked up that night. They were $1,000 ahead. They had $1,000 surplus. They couldn't figure it out anyway. Checked it over, timed again, but they had $1,000. About a year and a half or 2 years later, there's a farmer came in from out here with a cigar box, and he had full of money, and he was just crying almost. He said when he drew out $2,000 that day from the bank, and he went and buried it in his yard. But when he dug it up, he found there was only $1,000 in there instead of $2,000, and he didn't know how anybody could have got it. Well, they just figured that when they counted out the 1,000, maybe went back for more, he thought he got all his money and he had there. He'd never counted it. And they said, well, that's it, and they paid him the $1,000. These are kind of humorous since they don't mean much, I guess, in the history of Oklahoma. But there's one other very funny thing. A lot of funny things happen. One morning, coming up Broadway from Reno was a man and a woman and a boy about 18, stark naked. They didn't have shoes on or anything, none of it. And the police, of course, got them about the time they got to Grand Avenue. And they took them into the police station. And people were running from all directions. There was the biggest crowd in that police station I think we've ever had. Well, anyway, he was Adam and she was Eve. And I never did know whether the boy was Cain or Abel. But anyway. Now the biggest gambling house outside of Battle Row was the Southern Club on the second floor in the building just east of the Culbertson building there, corner of Grand and Broadway. And we knew it was running all the time, and I guess the sheriff and county attorney did, but we wanted to make sure. We sent 2 reporters there one night while the gambling was going on, and then we phoned the county attorney that gambling was going on there. Oh, well, we'll pursue it right away. Well, the 2 reporters said that the telephone rang and the proprietor answered the phone, then came back and says, the law is coming, come and close everything up. So there wasn't anything going on when the sheriff and the county attorney got there. I won't tell you who the county attorney was. Now, one of the first big arguments you had, and you might say fights in the newspaper, although it was not a very important fight in one way, was whether we were to have single statehood, the 2 territories, Indian Territory and Oklahoma combined, or whether we would have separate 2 states. Most of the people in Indian Territory wanted 2 states, and they were vociferous in advocating that. And we were just as vociferous in advocating 1 single state. We thought 2 little states would not amount much. We wanted Oklahoma to be a big state. Well, anyway, of course, I don't think that the Congress ever would have approved 2 states, but they didn't. It was, of course, when they did authorize it by the Enabling Act, they provided that the 2 should be joined together and that the capital should be in Guthrie until 1913. Well, the Constitutional Convention provided for the initiative and referendum. And after we were a state and they had the capital at Guthrie, but I didn't see any right reason why we couldn't have a petition passed around through the state and get people to vote on where they want the capital, because we were a sovereign state. And attorneys assured me that that was null and void as far as the Congress is concerned. They couldn't control a sovereign state after it had been admitted. We could put our state institutions anywhere we wanted to. So I got Judge Ledbetter to draw up a petition, and we got all of our circulation men who traveled around the state getting subscriptions, and some in town too, to circulate these petitions. And after a couple of months or so, we had sufficient to call an election. Well, by that time, the Chamber of Commerce got enthused, and they took hold of it, and we had, one day, we had 4 special trains out of here going in different directions with speakers. We had over 200 public speakers advocating the removal of capital to Oklahoma City. Well, I had insisted on putting in Shawnee, Guthrie, and Oklahoma City and make their choice. Judge Ledbetter was very loath to put in Shawnee. He said there wasn't any need. I said, well, they'll vote for Shawnee and they won't vote for Guthrie, and we'll be that much ahead. Well, anyway, we won by a little over 50,000, and Shawnee was such a bad third. But it went to the Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court here decided that was invalid because the wording Judge Ledbetter had used was not exactly the wording that was mentioned in the statute. So they threw it out. Well, we immediately started another one with the right question in there and left out Shawnee. And this second election carried by more than 50,000. And the funny thing is, I haven't happened to see any historical account, and I know some historical books about Oklahoma don't mention anything about a second election. All the one election, and we won by 50-odd thousand. And I don't know why that doesn't show up in the record somewhere. But anyway, it is very important to us that we did that. Well, now, perhaps I should go back a little bit. All during this time, the time I came here and for numbers of years afterwards, even till after statehood, the railroads once a month had special round-trip rates called homesickers excursions. And lots of people came in there, and that's how we got a lot of. But in Teddy Roosevelt, at the time, just before the Enabling Act, he had a special census taken, as most of you know, in 1907. We had 32,205 population in Oklahoma City. The regular census came along in April 1910, and we had 64,000 and 1 or 200. Almost exactly 100% growth in 2 years and 8 months. And that was because of our getting statehood and because of our getting these homesickers excursions, and the publicists went there. And then about this time, 1909, we had a visit by a man who wanted to build a packing plant here. And Mr. Wilson, Charles E. Wilson. At that time, he was executive vice president of Morrison and Company. And we had to keep this hush-hush. And there were several days of negotiations with a few of the leading men in the town. Of course, the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Mr. Classen, who, of course, owned a lot of property in the street railway. And Mr. Chartel, John Chartel, who was attorney for them and a leader. Well, that one night at the close of our negotiations, we stayed up till 1 o'clock. I was one of 4 people that signed the contract at 1 o'clock in the morning that we would give a bonus of $300,000 for the location of this packing plant here. And I knew I didn't think I'd ever have $300,000 my whole life, but I signed it anyway. And then at that time, G.B. Stone was a real estate man. This all had to be kept quiet because he sent him over across the river. There was no bridge there except at Capitol Hill. And he bought up all the land that was afterwards transferred to Morrison Company, and later to Schwarzschild and Sulzberger was the next packing plant we got a year later. And we offered to give them $300,000. Of course, that's what they wanted. And we had a meeting, the first meeting to raise the $300,000. It took 2 or 3 days for us to raise that amount for the Morrison Company plant. The next year, when we were going to get the second plant, we called a public meeting. There was a second floor over a store building just beyond the Cat's drugstore, Main and Robinson. And couldn't everybody get up there? There was such a crowd wanted to get in. People filled the stairway and were out on the sidewalk, and everybody could get in was up there. And they called for, and somebody give 5,000, somebody give 1,000, somebody give 500, and some 10,000, and so on. So they got up to about 285,000, and I.M. Putnam was a real estate man, says, "I'll take the rest." He never paid it, but then he it wasn't, I think, because he didn't want to. It was because we had kind of a depression come along that prevented him doing that. But in the first one, I ought to tell another story about C.G. Jones. I've been telling too many stories. This is going to get awfully long. But in the main things that built Oklahoma City, I might run down them a little bit. The first thing was the coming to Rock Island, the next the coming to Frisco, then the statehood fight in the state capitol, packing plants, the city streetcars, Lake Overholser, 1916, State Fair, 1906. The interurbans later, the removal of the tracks here was later. The good roads were started. We had no roads, anywhere paved, and so on down. Well, anyway, at the time they wanted to get the Frisco Railroad here. It was headed for Guthrie because that is state capital, and the two towns were about the same size, and they thought they should go to the state capital. Well, Mr. Overholser, that was Henry Overholser, the father of Ed Overholser. He was the moneyed man, and he was very aggressive and ambitious, but he didn't make too good an appearance to talk. He wasn't a good talker. C.G. Jones was called Gristmill Jones because he had a little flour mill down on the Canadian River, and do you suppose he ran that mill with water? But that's what he did. Well, anyway, he was a great promoter. He's a big fellow, weighed about 225, and he had also the self-assurance was necessary, good-looking, fast talker. So Mr. Overholser bought him a new suit of clothes to go with him up to St. Louis to see the Frisco people. And they went up there, and they argued and talked around there for 10 days or more, and Mr. Overholser got tired. He said, "Let's go home. We aren't getting anywhere. Let's go home." Jones says, no, I will stay here with it. Well, Overholser said, "All right, you can stay here, but I'm going to go home." And then he went to the hotel, and he wanted the hotel proprietor to cash his check for $200. Well, the proprietor hesitated a little bit and says, "I'll cash it if you'll get C.G. Jones to endorse it." Of course, we had lots of trouble with getting improvements for the city, just as we have now. And the waterworks were simply points driven into the riverbed of the North Canadian. And they pump water out from 15 or 20 feet down in the gravel. And they thought that was enough. Well, some engineers located the site for Lake Overholser, and we tried to vote that in. Well, on the third election in 1916, it carried, but 2 elections it was defeated. And that was our first waterworks outside of those points in the river. Of course, they were very poor roads. We see not having any automobiles. And by the way, the first one that came here was brought here by Harry Shelby, one of the councilmen. And it was really a buggy, it looked like a buggy anyway, and had a 1-cylinder engine under the seat. And he came out here to try it on Broadway. And there's quite a little rise here between 1st and 2nd on Broadway. And he attempted to go up that hill. And people gathered on sidewalks both sides. And it went up, chugging, got slower and slower. Died and rolled back down. And he tried it again, and he got up there about the same. He gave a groan and died, go down. He wind it up again and go up. About the 6th time he got up there, it just barely got over onto 2nd Street, and the people threw up their hats and hollered. That was our first automobile. Now, there were efforts to make good roads. There was no paving in the state anywhere. And, of course, the automobiles made a necessity of it, more or less. And there was a good roads organization. Mr. Singletary was our secretary. He worked here with Stanley Draper and worked for years developing roads over the state. Of course, they were rather poor roads. But there's a man that was even ahead of him down at Ardmore, Sidney Sugg. And he just spent his time going around the state holding little meetings, and he'd he had a guitar and he'd play Turkey in the Straw and a lot of things like that, and he'd get a crowd and he'd talk good roads. Well, anyway, eventually we started with the first paved road was from here to Guthrie. It was paved with brick. I don't know whether any of you are here remember that. I suppose a few of you must remember that. Of course, it's since been resurfaced, but the brick is under there. It's a pretty good foundation for an asphalt road, too, I think. Well, now, when it came to moving the state capital, you know, Haskell didn't like Guthrie, and there were some of the others didn't, and he wanted to move the capital to Oklahoma City. And I.M. Putnam, who was developing a lot of lots and houses out north Clashon and out west, Putnam City he originated out there. He built a building out there which he offered to give to the state for state capital. The old building, I don't know if they're still there or not. And he tried his best to get them to move the capital there. Well, there was Campbell Russell was a very energetic citizen here, and he had the idea of going the exact center of the state was 9 miles northeast of downtown Oklahoma City, about somewhere near the entrance to the Turner Turnpike, I think. He advocated going out there and getting 2,000 or 3,000 acres, carving it up into the lots, giving a large plot for the capital to be in the center of it, and sell the lots off to pay for the capital. Well, that was a good deal of a socialist idea, and people who had property here in Oklahoma City didn't want the capital moved 9 miles away. So there was a big hassle about it, but in the end, the citizens here gave a lot of ground, including the site of the capital was given by Mr. Culbertson, who owned 160 acres here, including that site. And I don't remember how many acres he gave, 30, 40 acres. And a lot of us who had lots around there signed them over to the State Capital Commission. And those lots were sold. Some of them, I think the state's got a few of them yet. And they should have kept them all because they found oil on most of them. And that reminds me that one of the most important things that happened that's given very little attention, about 1910 or 11, Mr. Clark was our park commissioner. And he advocated the idea of building a boulevard clear around the city, 29 miles, minimum of 200 feet wide and places 300 feet wide, and to have a park at the corners of each, it's kind of a quadrangle and yet a circle. Well, anyway, he got Lincoln Park, Will Rogers Park, Brock Park, and Tosper Park, and connected it with this grand boulevard around here. And the gimmick was to vote $400,000 in bonds to pay for that. And we had opposition from some of the biggest men in town. Mr. Bass, who was the Bass and Harbor Furniture Company, the largest furniture company here, had a big argument to me what a waste of money it was. $400,000 for that road and all that. Well, the city has had several $1 million in oil right from that, from the parks and from that, and so it was one of the best forward-looking moves that was ever made for the city, I think. Now, there are a lot of later things most of you are familiar with, and well, there's one thing I do want to tell of. When we wanted to move, we were in that little building on 28 South Broadway, and I got a man to build a building in 2 stories, 50 by 65 feet in basement for us, and we moved in there in the fall of 1903, just as soon as we could get it built, and we put in new machinery and so on. But they wanted to move, wanted to get a new post office here, and the Chamber of Commerce and all the leading citizens, Bill Petty and Bill Hales and Frank Johnson, head of the bank, and lots of others. They all got together and agreed where they're going to put it. They're going to put on Harvey, between Grand and Maine, on the west side of Harvey. And they had 8 or 10 lots in there they were going to give to government. And it was all fixed up. There's unanimous recommendation. All the leading men in town and the Chamber of Commerce, everybody, they get to sign it. Everybody agreed. Well, I knew a man named George Flick. This hadn't been told. I think probably not a dozen people who know about this. Anyway, a man named George Flick that I'd had some experience with before, and he had an entree with the Post Office Department in Washington. Well, as I said before, the water used to back up against the Rock Island tracks, and then it would flood Main Street and all the other streets. And we had a picture of this Harvey Street right at this block where they were going to put the post office. And the water was 8 inches deep. And George Flick and I decided to take that post office up there, a postal department that might do something. And so he took that up there. Well, they sent a commission down here to locate the post office. Of course, they showed them what they'd recommended. And they didn't pay much attention, but they went looking around on their own. And of course, we had nothing to do with it, but they picked on 3rd and Robinson, high ground, of course. And they went ahead and bought it and told them that's where the post office was going to be. Well, they were the most dumbfounded people you ever saw. I heard them, they'd talk to me, and how in the world they ever did that. Everybody was agreed on that. That's way out of town. Why would anybody want to walk up there to get their mail? And to this day, I think they're all dead now. They don't know what happened. But it's a fortunate thing that we didn't have it down there in that yesterday. See. Now, of course, there were later things that happened, but I think I'd be getting into the history. You know about the removal of the Rock Island tracks. I presume most of you know about that. And some of you were here. I know it's worthwhile to tell that. But that was a fight of 25 years. We had a committee, of which I was a member, and we fought and argued with the railroads. We'd get the presidents of railroads down here and argue with them, and they'd make propositions, but we never could get them to remove those tracks. And they'd suggested they might remove some of the freight trains if we'd let the passenger trains go through. Well, a commission was appointed by the Chamber of Commerce, I believe, 3 men. I won't name them because it's not necessary. And they argued then and they came to a sort of a verbal agreement. They'd let the Rock Island maintain its passenger trains right through here, which is alongside the Skirvin Hotel, and clear through past the City Hall and all, and the Frisco around there. They let them that and keep the freight trains down where the south where they are now. Well, I was very unhappy about that, and I went to 2 members of that commission, and I couldn't get anywhere. One of them said he'd resign and wasn't going to have anything to do with it, and the other one was going to agree to this thing, allowing the passenger trains in there, and I knew it about as bad as they had the freight trains. So it occurred to me that Frank Buttram knew the president of Metropolitan Life. He was a friend of his, and he'd helped Mr. Let's see. Wait a minute, I'll get his name in. The president of the Life, anyway. He knew him very well and had made some money for him in oil. And I went to Frank and I said, now, Mr. Ickes, that isn't his name. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, he said to him, I said to him, he is the head of the Metropolitan Life. The Metropolitan Life owns the bonds on the Rock Island and the Frisco and has got a representative on the board of each of those companies. And they're in the receivership, and he can tell them to do what he wants done. Please go to him and talk to him, show him the situation. We've got to have those tracks out of our main streets. Frank Buttram was eager to do that. He went to him and told him the story. He says, why, the railroads can't stand in the way of the growth of Oklahoma City. They're silly. They're hurting their own business. He told him to come down here and make a deal now and sell that right away to Oklahoma City. And we voted bonds, $4 million, and bought the tracks that you know, Couch Drive and all that, and all of the Civic Center, which was the Frisco Depot and Freight Depot and over there. We got it all for $4 million, and got our Civic Center that way. So that is one of the important things that happened. Of course, you know, there are many other important things like the coming of oil and so forth, but that's all late history. Oh, there's one thing that was of interest. Sarah Bernhardt was coming here in 1906. The Overholser, 1907, I guess it was. The Overholser Opera House had just been built. And she'd agreed to come here. Well, Sarah Bernhardt, you know, was somebody coming to the United States and touring the country. She had refused to go to the Union League Club in Chicago, but our society editor, who was Mrs. Jobson, afterwards Mrs. Henley, suggested that we ought to wire her and ask her to have a after theater dinner. Well, I said, I don't think there's much chance, but we'll try it. We wired her. We got the answer back in French, accepting. Well, then we were put to it. The best restaurant in town, the best meal was 35 cents. But they had a club up at the top of the Empire Building, that 4-story building next to Criterion Theater. And the lunches there were 35 cents. It was a little too high priced for a lot of people. But we figured we'd demand $1.50. And we'd get up the best dinner we could, and everybody'd wear white ties and tails, you know, and just show them that we knew what was what. And she came and put on a marvelous performance, every word of it in French. And every one of us were fascinated. You almost forgot that you didn't understand the language. That's a fact. It was a marvelous acting, and we were thrilled by it. Well, then after the show, we went over there, and of course, I realized that Sarah Bernhardt had turned down the Union League Club. She'd been in 1,000 places like that, but she wanted to see what the wild and woolly West was like, and she did. I think that I've given you an awful lot of talk, and I'm afraid I've given you a headache, but if you have some questions, I'll try to answer them if there's something that I've overlooked that you...
The next comments are by Mr. Albert Florer, F-L-O-R-E-R, a retired Oklahoman now living in Gentry, Arkansas.
Things I know about the opening of the Cherokee Strip. About September the 10th, 1893, two young men on horseback and their father driving a covered wagon started for the opening of the strip. A part of Oklahoma Territory, a strip of land about 60 miles wide, reaching from the Osage Indian Reservation to New Mexico and Colorado, to be open for homestead by racing. The first person staking and claiming possession of land by filing on it, and land of range of township and section, with the fee of $14.14 per 160 acres, by improving and living on the land for 3 years it would be theirs. Desiring to race from the south border of the strip, they made their way from Kansas, from Hewins, Kansas, south across the Osage Indian Reservation, crossing the Arkansas and the Cimarron River to a point on the north boundary of the Cherokee Indian Reservation, known as the Dalton Springs, about 2 miles south of Turleton, Oklahoma, Pawnee County. At noon, the soldiers firing a gun as a time to start the race. On September the 16th, 1893, the race was off. About 100 or more persons on horseback and wagons and so forth, each one striving to be first to his choice of land. A prairie fire the night before had left the grass cinders about 3 inches deep all over the country, and by night you could hardly tell colored man from white man. The two young men were J.E. and S.O. Floor. Across the House Creek, going north, J.E. staked a claim firing with gun. S.O. Floor, riding about 3/4 or so farther north, staked a claim. Then the finding of cornerstones placed by the government of numbers of land, and the range, section, township was the next most concern. The trip west to the land office at Perry, Oklahoma, and what a turmoil, so many people from most everywhere. The desirable and the undesirable. The first there was the first served in order as they stood in line. Unrest, impatience, hardship, anxiety. People became very restless, and some selling their standing places in line for money. Soldiers and policemen trying to keep order among the men. All kinds of people from most everywhere. In January of 1894, J.E. and S.O. Floor moved into their claim with their young wives and one child each. A few herd of cattle, some hogs, chickens, starting to build log houses, barns, fencing, and clearing land for the planting of with 2 good horses each. Only the brave and hard-working people would undertake such in those days. There were several hideouts from noted outlaws in the country, and not all the settlers were desirable. There was stealing of cattle and horses and harness and other things. And speaking of outlaws, 2 better-to-do families who owned a large herd of cattle on the free range broke into father's corn fodder one fall and destroyed it. He put them on a lot made of rails and went to see the owners. No one at home, said his wife at the first place. He went to the others, and she said no one to home. But he could see several horses with saddles on in the barn. As he returned home, a man well armed rode up from behind him, demanding the release of the cattle. Riding along with father after reaching home, the first man he went to see rode up also. They, after a heated debate, they drove off the cattle while mother hid the shotgun from father. Afterward learning that the first man that had rode along with him had a reward of $5,000 dead or alive. He was later killed for a reward, but his gang were afraid to try to collect. Father and neighbors lost their harness later and almost lost their horses. They went to Sapulpa, Guthrie, Stillwater, hunting for them, but to no avail. It was not uncommon to see from 3 to 4, 5 armed men. But government officers were on the watch, and after a gun battle with government officers and outlaws about 9 miles east of Stillwater, known as Ingles, they were seen less frequent from then on. Another incident I thought was funny was 2 neighbors going to church together and their children to school together. One neighbor, after several years, said to the other, "Were you in the Andersonville prison in the Civil War?" "Yes." "Were you ridden on a rail while there?" One was on the south and the other on the north. They never had much to do with each other after that. Father would be subpoenaed for jury duty every year, seemed like, and Mother and I were afraid to be alone on account of bad people. After the railroad came through, it was a great thing for most everyone, as old and young, loved to see the train go through town and to ride to Tulsa or Pawnee or Emmett. I remember riding train to Pawnee to the old settlers' reunion once a year, and what a time we kids had. Another time Pawnee Bill, or Gordon Lilly, and Buffalo Bill, or Bill Cody, came to Pawnee about the year of 1906 with their shows, and what a thrill everyone in those days. In afterward years, I counted 105 buffalo cows and calves on Pawnee Bill's pasture. It was always a thrill to go to the Indian village at Pawnee, west of Pawnee, and to watch the Indians and their manner of dress and dances. We used to visit back up in Kansas, near Hewins and Cedarvale, Kansas, most every year or so, and we went by covered wagon. And we'd make the first day to Pawhuskee and come to see a lot of Osage Indians and their fine horses and hundreds of longhorn cattle from Texas on the Osage pastures. Crossing the Arkansas River was not very funny. Back east of Cleveland, at the Black Dog Crossing, my father broke the ice part way once. About 1908, oil was discovered in that area of Pawnee and the Osage County. Cleveland City at one time had one or more oil rigs on about every dock. There was the Bartlesville sand, the Layton sand, and the Tucker sand. The South Field was very productive for a long time south of Cleveland. The Johnson oil refinery was built, and the 101 Ranch was a very noted those days, owned by the Miller brothers of Billings, Oklahoma, known the world over as Pawnee Bill's Ranch for several years. Times have changed since those two world wars, and the way of life seems much different. But on the other side of life in those days was the poor, neighborly Samaritan Christian people. Deer and turkey, wild game, wild bears, the creek were clear and lots of fish. Schools and churches and roads were being built. White and colored people went to the same school and church for a few years. Corn and cotton were about the main crop. Corn sold for 10 to 15 cents a bushel, cotton for 2 and 3 cents a pound on the market at Perry, which was about 60 miles west. It taken 2 days out and 2 days back, and hogs were only 2 and 3 cents a pound. By 1903, the Frisco Railroad branch line from Tulsa to Enid began, and the country began to prosper. A town site was bought by the Arkansas Valley Town Site Company. Some of the land from Mr. C.C. Hicks, some from Mr. James Langston, Mr. Tom Beasley, and Mr. Barnard. A store and a post office 1 mile east of town, owned by J.E. and S. 04, moved to a new location near the railroad. A bank was built by Mr. Hayward Hayden of New York City, now operated as a post office. S.04 built the first house, and his son, Martin Floor, was the first baby born in the town of Turleton. The Christian Union Church, the Methodist Church, the Church of Christ, and the Latter-day Saint Church were soon built along with the public schools. By 1914, the town was booming. C.E. Kibber's Hardware, Floor's General Store and Post Office, Coleman's Drug, B.B. Grant's Clothing and Groceries, 2 hotels, the Wright Hotel and the Cranbrook Hotel, telephone lines, 2 cotton gins, carload after carload of pipe were unloaded for pipelines crossing the country, both oil and gas, and a large tank farm of 5,500 barrel tanks, hundreds of men and horses working. The bank was